Spider-Man has a long history in video games, from the classic arcade games of the 1980s to modern open-world platforms. Let's swing into action with our friendly neighborhood webhead and see how the franchise has evolved over the last 40 years. It took 20 years from the character's creation to his first video game title. Spider-Man for the Atari 2600 was released in 1982. Developed by Parker Brothers, the game was based on the Spider-Man cartoon series that aired on CBS at the time. It was also the first game in history to feature a Marvel character. The game was a simple action-adventure platformer, where players controlled Spider-Man as he swung and climbed through the city, with the ultimate goal of defeating the Green Goblin. Though praised as captivating, contemporary gaming magazines accused the developers of shamelessly copying the gameplay of Crazy Climber. Nowadays, the game is mostly known for its TV commercial featuring a hyperactive Green Goblin taunting Spidey. Average. In 1984, the web-slinger made his debut on the PC, with Quest Probe featuring Spider-Man. This was the second of 3 Quest Probe titles, alongside the Hulk and the Fantastic Four. It was a series of text-based puzzle games, developed by the short-lived Adventure International for various PCs of the time, including fan favorites BBC Micro, Commodore 64 and Apple II. Text-based games were nothing new, but Quest Probe titles were unique for using illustrations to enhance the story. In his first PC outing, Spidey had to find his way through the Daily Bugle building, solving puzzles, collecting gems and fighting villains like Doc Ock, Mysterio and Sandman. Each Quest Probe game also had a tie-in comic book. Vile. In his second PC game, Spidey teamed up with Captain America to take on Doctor Doom and his army of villains, including Rhino, Boomerang, Grey Gargoyle and Batroc the Leaper. Unfortunately, Cap and Spidey never really teamed up, instead taking turns fighting the baddies. Negative reviews kept pouring in, as most players complained that the game rarely loaded properly. When it did work, the controls were a nightmare of unresponsiveness and incooperative characters. The game ended up on a lot of worst games ever lists. Garbage. Would you believe Spider-Man once was a video game villain? Admittedly, it wasn't for a Marvel title. In 1989, Sega developed a ninja action game called The Revenge of Shinobi for the Genesis. Players controlled a white ninja who fought his way through various levels. But this is where it gets interesting, as some of his enemies were Batman, the Terminator, Rambo and our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. The game's creator used these popular characters as a blueprint, but expected the development team to redesign them. This never happened, so the final product got shipped with Spider-Man, RoboCop and Batman as the villains. We wouldn't want to be in the shoes of Sega's lawyers in 1989. The next official Spider-Man game came out in 1990 and it has become something of a cult classic over the years. The Amazing Spider-Man is a simple platformer and it's also known as the Skeleton Spider-Man game, because of the unique health bar featured in the game. With each hit, Spidey's portrait would slowly deteriorate into a skeleton, until there was not much left of our web-slinger except a Spidey-themed skullcap. Maybe this is where the inspiration for Marvel Zombies came from. Vile. The same year, Spidey also made his debut on the Game Boy, with this green and black side-scroller. Players controlled Spider-Man as he traveled through New York's back alleys, parks, rooftops and sewers, fighting multiple villains. There were also a few levels in which Spidey crawled up a building, dodging falling projectiles and avoiding killer birds, for some reason. Level bosses included Mysterio, Rhino, Scorpion and Venom. The end goal was to reunite Parker with Mary Jane, but we have to say, she looks pretty worse for wear in this one. Sensational. 1990 was a pretty busy year for Spider-Man, as he also debuted on the Sega Genesis, in Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin. Mary Jane got herself captured once again and Spider-Man had to go up against an assortment of his rogues gallery to get her back, including Venom, Hobgoblin, Vulture, Electro and the titular Kingpin. The most unlikely part of the game is the ending, which had J. Jonah Jameson award the title of Employee of the Month to Peter Parker. That could never happen. Average. In 1991 we got another Game Boy title, The Punisher, The Ultimate Payback, in which Frank Castle had to shoot his way through the docks, an airport, a jungle and finally a bunch of caves, to ultimately defeat Jigsaw. The gameplay was rudimentary, as it was just a glorified shooting range simulator. Despite being prominently featured on the game box, Spider-Man only had a minor cameo, as an informant to the Punisher. What a waste of our favorite web-slinger. Vile. Next we have a side-scrolling beat-em-up for coin-operated arcade machines, in the style of Streets of Rage. Spider-Man could play alone or alongside 3 other players, who could choose between Black Cat, Hawkeye and Namor. The ultimate goal was to defeat Doctor Doom, after beating level bosses Venom, Doc Ock, Electro and Green Goblin. The game made quite a splash at the time, being praised by gaming magazines and topping arcade machine earnings for several months. Amazing. The positive reviews garnered by Spider-Man's original Game Boy title led to the development of the sequel, under the Acclaim banner. The game added several new features, like new level designs, collectible objects and an assortment of new villains, including Carnage, Graviton and Hobgoblin. Not much else to say about this one, to be honest. Menace. NES gamers would rejoice in 1992, as Spider-Man finally debuted with the return of the Sinister Six. The game was inspired by the popularity of the comic book story of the same name. Players controlled Spider-Man through 6 side-scrolling levels, with each member of the titular supervillain team as a level boss. The game wasn't a huge success, as its controls were flawed and Spidey often found himself swinging right past his enemies. Garbage. The next one is a cult classic. 1992's Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Players would fight their way through various levels, controlling either Spider-Man, Wolverine, Cyclops, Storm or Gambit. Arcade is revealed as the final boss, to be defeated by Spider-Man. Although the game was a success because it allowed players to control a multitude of fan favorites from the Marvelverse, players often complained about the high difficulty setting and the merciless grind. Menace. Game Boy players were blessed with a 3rd installment of the Spider-Man franchise in 1993, Invasion of the Spider Slayers. This time, Spidey had to go up against an army of Alistair Smythe's murderous robots, the Spider Slayers. Before defeating the final baddie, however, Spidey had to solve a throng of puzzles and defeat a host of level bosses, including Electro and Scorpion. Garbage. SNES and GameCube players got a treat in late 1994, when Maximum Carnage was released. A side-scrolling beat-em-up based on the comic book story of the same name, allowing players to guide Spider-Man and Venom through several levels, in an attempt to stop Carnage and his minions. Unfortunately, cameos by Captain America, Black Cat, Morbius and Iron Fist couldn't save the game from pretty lackluster reviews. However, the game has seen a revival in recent years, with modern-day players giving it more favorable reviews. Vile. Spider-Man came to the Super Famicom in 1995, with Lethal Foes. In this side-scrolling action game, Spidey had to walk, crawl or swing his way through various levels that pitted him against the likes of Mysterio, Beetle, Scorpion, Doc Ock and Carnage. There's not much to say about this one, as reviewers of the time pretty unanimously panned the game as hopelessly boring. Average. Speaking of mediocre, another Spider-Man game that seems to have slipped into obscurity is Venom Spider-Man Separation Anxiety for the Sega Genesis and the SNES. This was a sequel to Maximum Carnage and came with a hot seat option, allowing players to play solo or form a duo with Venom to defeat Carnage. The game boasted an assortment of symbiotes and also featured cameos by Captain America, Ghost Rider, Hawkeye and Daredevil. Regardless, players criticized the repetitive button mashing, the boring and formulaic fights and the linear gameplay. Vile. Another side-scroller for the SNES was launched in 1995, based on the very popular Spider-Man animated series. The game later received a Sega Genesis port too. Players had to battle their way through various locations, including J. Jonah Jameson's apartment, fighting various villains, from the Lizard and Green Goblin to Scorpion and Venom. Average. 1996 saw the release of The Amazing Spider-Man, Web of Fire for the Sega 32X, aka Project Mars. The game had Spider-Man swinging through the city, battling various killer robots and thugs, as well as an assortment of lesser-known villains, including the Eel, Dragon Man, Thermite and Super Adaptoid. The ultimate goal was to thwart the efforts of Hydra and save New York City, with occasional assists from Daredevil. The timing of the game's release was terrible, as Sega had just announced they were dropping support for the 32X. As such, the game received little to no coverage in North America. Add to that the game's lack of innovation and creativity and you can sort of see why this title doesn't get talked about too often. Garbage. Moving on, have you ever played Monkey Island or Grim Fandango and thought to yourself, gee, I wish this game had Spider-Man in it? No? Well, no one else did either, which is probably why the 1996 game Spider-Man: The Sinister Six never received much attention. This was an MS-DOS point-and-click adventure that occasionally turned into a shooting gallery-type game. It was weird and nobody remembers it. Did it even happen or did we just imagine it? Vile. 2 years before the iconic Sam Raimi movie, we got a Spider-Man game for the PlayStation 1, developed using the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater engine. Players took control of Spidey as he swung and crawled his way through New York, battling the likes of Rhino, Venom, Mysterio and Dr. Octopus. Throughout the game, players were treated to sound bites of Peter Parker's legendary wit, as well as some of the voice actors from Spider-Man TAS and Spider-Man Unlimited reprising their roles.
Well, I hope they don't mind if I make a quick deposit.
Hey!
Oh boy. Yeah, that's right.
The game generally received positive reviews, but it didn't end up having a lot of staying power as the years went by. Spectacular. The game garnered a sequel for the Game Boy Color 1 year later. This time, Spidey had to make his way through various levels, fighting armed thugs and battling Rhino, Mysterio, Vulture, Scorpion, Kraven and Doc Ock, in an attempt to rescue Aunt May. Sensational. We're still 1 year away from Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man as we return to the PS1, with Spider-Man 2, Enter Electro. A sequel to the 2000 game, it followed Peter Parker fighting his way to Electro, while disposing of Sandman, Shocker, Lizard and Hammerhead. Unlike its predecessor, this game allowed Spidey to touch the ground without suffering an insta-kill. Another interesting feature was the ability to unlock new costumes granting special powers. Some of these suits were designed by legendary artist Alex Ross, one of which was part of the concept art he did for the Sam Raimi movie. Spectacular. One more game before we enter the age of Tobey Maguire. Spider-Man Mysterio's Menace for the Game Boy came out in 2001 and continued the story of Enter Electro. Spidey had to fight through 7 levels, defeating some of his previous foes, like Hammerhead and Electro, while also duking it out with some new baddies, including Scorpion, Big Wheel, Rhino and the titular Mysterio. Players could also collect upgrades to boost Spidey's abilities. The game was a smash hit in the States and Japan at the time. Average. We've reached 2002, the year Sam Raimi kicked off his Spider-Man trilogy. The first game to be released for the new franchise was the multi-platform action-adventure game titled Spider-Man. It came out for the PS2, the Xbox, the GameCube, Microsoft Windows and the Game Boy Advance. This was yet another beat-em-up, in which Spidey had to jump and swing through various indoor and outdoor areas, fighting thugs, as well as more established villains, including Vulture, Shocker, Kraven the Hunter and Scorpion. You'll notice that the game bears little resemblance to the actual movie, as it was developed in parallel to the film. A fun quirk, however, is that Spider-Man started the game in his initial DIY wrestling pajama from the movie. The game ended the year as one of Activision's top 5 franchises in North America and ranked 7th in overall sales for the PlayStation 2 console. Sensational. A sequel was developed around the time of Sam Raimi's second movie, the now legendary Spider-Man 2. Like its predecessor, the game came out for the PS2, Xbox, Game Boy Advance, Microsoft Windows, GameCube and Nintendo DS. A very successful port was also launched a year later for the PlayStation Portable. This was the first superhero video game in history to feature a full open-world design. Critics at the time lauded the realistic settings and backdrops, while players loved the swinging and fighting mechanics. It has since become a cult favorite, being labeled as one of the greatest superhero games of all time. Spider-Man 2 still stands as a pioneer of early open-world games, with some claiming the game helped revolutionize the open-world genre of video games. Amazing. In the early 2000s, Marvel Comics were all about the Ultimate Universe. 2005 brought the release of Ultimate Spider-Man, an action-adventure game published by Activision for the PS2, Xbox, Game Boy Advance, GameCube, Nintendo DS and PC. This game also incorporated an open-world design, with players taking on the role of either Spidey or Venom. The game relied heavily on a comic book aesthetic, a choice which has inspired future titles, such as 2010's Shattered Dimensions. Apart from the pretty high difficulty, the game has garnered praises across the board. There is also a limited edition, which has become something of a prized collector's item, since it features some extra behind-the-scenes and making-of footage, including an interview with the late great Stan Lee. Spectacular. The success of Ultimate Spider-Man led to the creation of the prequel, Spider-Man Battle for New York. This 2006 action game was released for the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS and allowed players to take on the role of either Spider-Man or Green Goblin, each with their unique abilities and story arcs. Despite the added features and gameplay mechanics, this game received considerably less praise than its predecessor, leading to lackluster reviews and mediocre sales figures. Menace. Hot on the heels of Sam Raimi's third installment in the franchise, Activision released Spider-Man 3, a third-person action-adventure game for PC, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Nintendo Wii and PC, with later ports for Game Boy Advance and the PSP. There's not a lot to say about this, since it didn't really catch on and the community pretty much rejected it, despite initial positive reviews by aggregator websites and gaming magazines. The game received widespread criticism for the short and uninteresting story mode and for the disappointing graphics. The ports were also criticized for differing widely across different platforms, on top of suffering from major glitches and bugs. All in all, not even Tobey Maguire's voice acting could save this one from becoming the runt of the litter. Menace. The same year brought us yet another Sam Raimi-inspired game, Spider-Man Friend or Foe. A beat-em-up platformer featuring two-player co-op mechanics, wherein one player controlled Spidey and his teammate took control of one of his allies, like Black Cat, Blade, Iron Fist, Venom, Lizard and Carnage, among others. Unfortunately, this game also suffered from major differences across various platforms, with some of the characters being playable only on some of the gaming systems. For instance, PSP players didn't get to enjoy Scorpion, Carnage and Electro, while only PS2 and Xbox 360 players got to play as Prowler or Silver Sable. The game was also criticized for its repetitive gameplay, rushed storyline and lack of diversity. Menace. 2008 brought another classic, Spider-Man Web of Shadows, a typical action-adventure game, in which Spider-Man fought to stop a symbiote infestation of New York City. An open-world game with nonlinear gameplay for its main releases, PS3, Xbox 360, Wii and PC. However, the PS2 and PSP ports featured vastly different game mechanics, turning it into a 2.5D side-scrolling beat-em-up, similar to Final Fight. Finally, there was the Nintendo DS port, which featured Metroidvania-style beat-em-up game mechanics. Pretty much every iteration of the game got a lukewarm reception from fans, due to poor controls, shoddy camera movement and a sloppy story. It has since become a nostalgia favorite, garnering plenty of playthroughs and longplays on YouTube. Due in part to cameos by Wolverine, Moon Knight and Luke Cage at various points in the game, no doubt. Sensational. 2009 brought us the first Spider-Man game exclusively developed for the mobile phone, Spider-Man Toxic City. The game was developed by Gameloft and was set in the Marvel's Ultimate Universe. It was your typical side-scrolling beat-em-up game, reminiscent of the old arcade games of previous decades. Just your run-of-the-mill button masher. Nothing to really write home to your Aunt May about. Vile. 8 years before Miles Morales stepped into the Spider-Verse, we got treated to Spider-Man: Shattered Dimensions. Players took control of 4 different Spidey variants from across the multiverse: Spider-Man, Spider-Man Noir, Ultimate Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2099. The game isn't considered the granddaddy of the Spider-Verse for nothing, as it inspired the comic book storyline Spider-Verse, which ultimately led to the creation of the 2018 animated masterpiece, Into the Spider-Verse, and its upcoming sequel. The game is also notable for its amazing voice cast. Neil Patrick Harris lends his voice to the traditional version of Spider-Man. Spider-Man Noir is voiced by C.D. Barnes, who is best known for doing the voice of the iconic 90s animated Spider-Man. The voice of Spider-Man 2099 belongs to Dan Gilvezan, best known for playing Spidey in the 80s animated series, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. Finally, Ultimate Spider-Man is voiced by Josh Keaton, who also does the voice of Spider-Man in The Spectacular Spider-Man TV show and Harry Osborn in the first and second Spider-Man games based on the Sam Raimi films. Spectacular. Ultimate Spider-Man: Total Mayhem is another mobile exclusive title. This is an action brawler developed by Gameloft with a pretty refreshing targeting system. In this game, Spidey had to take down several of his Rogues Gallery classics, including Green Goblin, Rhino and Electro, but also fight his way through common street thugs, symbiotes and goblin henchmen. The game is a fun, visually pleasing experience, with bright textures reminiscent of the deep contrasts and heavy saturation of the Ultimate comic book artwork. Menace. A much-anticipated sequel came out a year later and took us back to the Spider-Verse, Spider-Man: Edge of Time. It was released for the Nintendo DS, Nintendo 3DS, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 and Wii, and allowed players to play as Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2099 as they battle various villains, including Anti-Venom, Black Cat 2099 and Atrocity through our reality and the 2099 universe. Several other characters were released as DS exclusives, including Rhino, Shocker and Arcade 2099. Unfortunately, the game didn't live up to its hype and Spidey fans were left sorely disappointed by the lack of innovation and repetitive gameplay. Ultimately, the game failed to make an impression and not even the soundtrack was able to save it, despite being composed by Gerard Marino, lead composer for the God of War series. Average. In 2012, The Amazing Spider-Man movie came out, starring Andrew Garfield, and naturally an accompanying video game wasn't long behind. It was published by Activision and was available on every major platform of the time, including PC, the Xbox 360, PS3, Wii, Nintendo DS and Android and iOS. The game offered a fun open-world experience, without ever excelling in the graphics or gameplay department. The web-slinging mechanics of the game were lauded for the tight camera shots and the very immersive feeling. The stealth mode and combat system are nearly identical to the Arkham series, but slightly tweaked for Spider-Man's unique abilities and agility. There are plenty of side quests, but players soon discovered that they were very repetitive and tended to get tedious. Almost like homework. Menace. 2014 gave us another mobile game, Spider-Man Unlimited, also developed by Gameloft and featuring alternate versions of our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. The game was an endless runner, in which different versions of Spidey had to speed through various levels, dodge incoming obstacles, jump and swing to gather power-ups and occasionally dispose of various symbiotes and other foes. It's not considered a pay-to-play game, but it did feature an energy mechanic that limited the number of games you could play until a cooldown period, unless you acquired more energy through in-app purchases. One standout feature of the game is that it tapped into the Spider-Verse, as players could choose between different Spider-People, including Spider-Man Noir, Ultimate Spider-Man, Iron Spider, The Amazing Bagman, and Armored Spider. Despite the popularity of Homecoming and Into the Spider-Verse, the game was unfortunately shut down in 2019, leaving fans disappointed, especially since the story ended in a cliffhanger. Sensational. The same year saw the release of the second Andrew Garfield movie, as well as an accompanying video game title. This was the aptly titled The Amazing Spider-Man 2 for PC, PS4, Nintendo 3DS, Wii, Xbox 360 and Xbox One, as well as various mobile operating systems. Yet again, the combat system proved to be pretty frustrating, the gameplay was repetitive and the cutscenes were dull. However, as with previous titles, the developers have outdone themselves in terms of the swinging around mechanics. The left and right controls were mapped to Spidey's respective arms and the webs actually had to attach to a building, as opposed to previous titles, in which you could basically swing from cloud to cloud. Coupled with the great camera tracking, this created the most fun experience swinging around the city. Tragically, that's where the fun stops, because the combat system was once again identical to that of Arkham, only dumbed down. The best way to describe it is Arkham Light. The AI was pretty average, if not moronic, and the entire game just ended up being a button masher in between beautiful sessions of swinging through the city. Vile. We've finally arrived at the holy grail of Spider-Man games, Marvel's Spider-Man for the PS4. It's a surprisingly detailed and layered story, combined with exciting web-slinging mechanics and finally a combat system that isn't trying to copy other superhero games that came before it. Of course, this game also featured an assortment of unlockable Spidey suits, each with its unique powers, abilities and gadgets. The graphics are breathtaking, especially when swinging through New York City and taking in the sights. The orchestral score also knows when to swell and when to tone it down. A great experience overall accompanied by a matching soundtrack. An all-time classic. Amazing. The final game in our roundup is Marvel's Spider-Man, Miles Morales. Thanks to the popularity of Into the Spider-Verse and the 2018 PS4 game, Insomniac released this action-adventure game in 2020, featuring our second favorite web-slinger, Miles Morales. His first solo outing proves that Insomniac are getting comfortable with the franchise, churning out hit after hit. It's a worthy successor to the previous title, improving on a lot of flaws and adding tons of new features in terms of both story and gameplay. The story is so deeply engaging and gripping, that players might feel at times that they can't wait to be done with the playing part, to skip ahead to the next cinematic chapter. Amazing. So this is our tier list of every Spider-Man game from the last 40 years. We've reached the end of the line for now. But fear not, because the next Spider-Man game is already in the works. In fact, it's scheduled to be released in the fall of 2023. Do you remember playing your first Spider-Man game? Which game was it and how old were you? Tell us in the comments below, and if you liked this video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more amazing content. Until next time, stay nerdy.